Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. It was a clear summer morning on the island of Euboea. Sunlight glimmered on the waters of the Aegean, olive groves swayed in the warm wind, and yet the city of Eretria was choking on smoke. Its narrow streets ran red with terror. Foreign soldiers stormed through the marketplace, torching stalls, prying open temple doors, and hauling sacred statues into the dust. Roof beams collapsed in fire. Men were struck down where they stood, women and children dragged screaming into captivity. In one sweep, Eretria was unmade, its walls blackened, its treasures looted, its people bound for the slave markets of Asia. For the Persians who led this destruction, it was not wanton cruelty, it was justice. 9 years earlier, Eretria and Athens had dared to send ships and men across the sea to torch Sardis, a jewel city of the Persian king. Darius the Wise had sworn revenge. Now, a city had been traded for a city, Sardis for Eretria, and Persian honor was restored in fire. But retribution was only the first course. The army was not yet satisfied. Their true quarry, the larger prize, was still ahead. Athens, the upstart democracy that had struck at the empire's pride. And so, even as the ashes of Eretria smoldered, Persian eyes turned south to the Attic mainland. The flames of Eretria carried their message far. Refugees and survivors staggered across the straits to Athens, bringing stories of massacre. Whispers spread that the Persians spared those who submitted, but ground into dust those who resisted. Already, voices within Athens urged surrender. Better to open the gates and save the city than to suffer Eretria's fate. Yet not all Athenians agreed. In the assembly, men rose and thundered that submission meant more than survival. It meant slavery, tribute, and the slow death of their fragile democracy. They argued that Athens must fight, even if the odds were hopeless. That decision, taken in fear and fury, would set the stage for one of the most famous battles in the story of Western civilization. Imagine the contrast. On one shore, the colossal power of Persia, an empire spanning from Egypt to India, wealth beyond imagining, and an army so vast it drew warriors from dozens of nations. On the other, a single city-state with fewer than 40,000 citizens, barely a generation into its experiment with democracy, standing alone with one ally, Plataea. The imbalance was absurd, and yet the Athenians would gamble everything rather than bow. The choice to resist was not born only of courage, it was also born of necessity. Athens was divided. Powerful families whispered of cutting a deal with Persia, securing their own fortunes in exchange for betraying the city. Only a victory in the field could silence them. Retreat to the city's walls risked political collapse. The people would panic, and the pro-Persian faction might seize control. The army had to fight, and it had to win, before internal strife destroyed them more surely than Persian swords. As the Persian fleet pushed down the coast, its prows gleaming like the teeth of a predator, the Athenians marshaled their hoplites. Farmers left their fields, potters left their kilns, fathers kissed their children goodbye and donned armor. Bronze helmets were polished, spears sharpened, shields strapped tight. From Athens and from tiny Plataea, they gathered, 11,000 men in all, marching out to meet destiny on the plain of Marathon. But before we set foot on that fateful field, it is worth pausing over the scale of what was about to collide. Persia was not a barbarous horde, as later propaganda would claim. It was the superpower of its age, disciplined, organized, and sophisticated. Its troops came not only from Persia proper, but from across the empire: Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, Scythians, each contributing to an army as diverse as the empire itself. Behind them stood a logistical machine that could move men and horses across seas and sustain them in foreign lands. To the Greeks, the Persians seemed as inexhaustible as the sea. The Greeks, by contrast, brought only the hoplite phalanx, citizen soldiers armored in bronze, fighting shoulder to shoulder with heavy spears and shields. They had little cavalry, no archers to speak of, and they were badly outnumbered. Their advantage was stubbornness, discipline, and the determination of free men defending their own soil. And so the stage was set. an empire of millions against a city-state of thousands, an army of conquest against a citizen militia, the prize, Athens itself, and perhaps the survival of Greek independence. Even at this early moment, one can sense why Marathon looms so large in history. The battle was never just about numbers, it was about meaning. To Persia, Greece was a rebellious fringe, a frontier to be pacified. To Athens, the fight at Marathon would prove whether a small democracy could resist the greatest empire the world had yet seen. As the smoke of Eretria drifted over the Aegean, Athens steeled itself for the storm. The Persians had burned one city. Now they marched for another. And on a flat coastal plain, less than 40 kilometers from the Acropolis, the fate of Athens would be decided. To understand why Athens and Eretria drew the wrath of Persia, we must look back nearly a decade before the fires of Eretria, to the restless coasts of Asia Minor. There, along the shores of Ionia, Greek city-states lived as subjects of the Persian Empire. They kept their language and their customs, but their overlords were Persian satraps and local tyrants loyal to Darius the Great. In 499 BCE, that arrangement cracked. The Ionian Revolt began not as a grand ideological struggle, but as a tangle of politics, taxes, and grievances. Yet like sparks in dry grass, it spread quickly. Tyrants were overthrown. City after city declared independence, and Persian garrisons found themselves besieged. To Persia, it was not only rebellion, it was contagion. If one corner of the empire could secede, why not another? For an empire that stretched across 3 continents, rebellion could not be tolerated. And then came the act that Darius would never forgive. In 498 BCE, Ionian rebels, aided by a small force of ships and men from Athens and Eretria, marched inland and torched the city of Sardis, a vital Persian administrative hub. Its temples and palaces blazed against the night sky. To the rebels, it was a stunning blow. To Darius, it was an insult that reached his very throne. The revolt was eventually crushed. The Persians responded with methodical brutality. Cities were retaken, populations punished, order restored. But the insult lingered. Athens and Eretria, far across the sea, had dared to raise a hand against the King of Kings. Herodotus tells us that Darius ordered a servant to whisper to him at every meal, "Master, remember the Athenians." Whether true or not, the story captures the mood. Revenge had become personal. Yet vengeance alone does not explain the scale of what followed. By the 490s, Darius had ruled for over 3 decades. He had seized the throne in 522 through intrigue and bloodshed, and though he had stabilized his empire, challenges to his authority still lurked. Rebellions flared at the edges, pretenders arose, distant satraps tested their limits. To project strength, Darius needed not merely to punish Athens and Eretria. He needed to demonstrate that no one, however small or distant, could defy Persia with impunity. The invasion of Greece was thus more than reprisal. It was theater. Every city that surrendered and paid tribute would reinforce the image of Persia's inevitability. Every city that resisted and was crushed, like Eretria, would serve as a warning. Conquest was propaganda carved into stone and fire. And behind this campaign lay a deeper vision. Persia had long meddled in Greek affairs. Through alliances and bribes, satraps had cultivated friendly tyrants within the city-states. The conquest of Athens and its neighbors was not only feasible, but desirable. It would anchor the Aegean as a secure frontier, eliminate a troublesome source of raids, and extend Persia's prestige into the very heart of the Greek world. When Darius ordered his generals Datis and Artaphernes to assemble an armada of hundreds of ships, he was not merely sending an army. He was sending a message that the great king's reach extended beyond mountains and seas, that no act of defiance would go unanswered, and that the fate of Sardis would echo back upon those who had kindled its flames. And so, as the fleet prepared to set sail, the Greeks knew what was coming. The Persians were not pirates on a raid. They were an empire, and empires did not forgive. They erased. The fleet that Persia unleashed in 490 BCE was unlike anything the Greeks had ever seen. Ancient sources tell us it numbered 600 ships, sleek triremes with bronze rams, wide transports heavy with cavalry, and supply vessels groaning under the weight of grain, water, and fodder for beasts of war. To the islanders who watched the horizon darken with sails, the sight must have been overwhelming. The sea itself seemed to have become Persian. Command was given to two men, Datis, a Median admiral renowned for his discipline, and Artaphernes, nephew of Darius and governor of Lydia. Between them, they commanded an expeditionary force of some 20 to 26,000 soldiers, though modern scholars debate the numbers. Ancient accounts often exaggerated, swelling Persian hosts into uncountable millions. Yet even with more modest estimates, the imbalance remained staggering. Against Athens and Plataea, Persia could field an army at least twice as large, perhaps 3 times. What made this army unique was not its size alone, but its diversity. The Persian Empire was the most cosmopolitan power of its age. Its soldiers came from every corner of its vast dominion. Medes with scale armor and short spears, Egyptians with tall shields, Assyrians with heavy helmets, Scythians with bows curved like crescents. Light infantry from the east carried wicker shields, quick to move and skilled with arrows. And perhaps most feared of all, Persian cavalry. Horsemen who could outmaneuver the clumsy Greek hoplite, circle around his shield wall, and cut him down from afar. To the Greeks, who fought mainly as heavy infantry in rigid formation, this variety was bewildering. Their strength was uniformity. Men drilled to fight shoulder to shoulder, identical in kit and style. The Persians, by contrast, embodied flexibility. Wherever the phalanx was weak, Persia had a tool to break it. Moving such a force across the Aegean was no small feat. Horses in particular posed a challenge. They had to be ferried in specially designed transports, packed with fodder and water, carefully unloaded at each landing. Grain had to be secured along the way, fresh water located or carried, firewood gathered for cooking. Armies march on their stomachs, and navies sail on their supplies. Datis and Artaphernes knew that without steady provisioning, even the might of Persia would wither into hunger and disease. The fleet's composition also served a symbolic purpose. By drawing soldiers from so many peoples, Darius demonstrated the reach of his empire. The campaign itself was propaganda. When Greeks saw Phoenicians, Egyptians, and Medes fighting under one banner, they were meant to understand that Persia was more than a kingdom. It was a world in arms. As the ships creaked across the Aegean, the Persians were not simply advancing. They were making a statement. Every island subdued, every city that surrendered or burned, carried a message back to Athens. Your walls cannot protect you. Your allies cannot save you. Resistance is hopeless. And yet, for all its power, the armada also carried seeds of vulnerability. A campaign across the sea was fragile. Storms could scatter ships. Supplies could run thin. Horses could sicken. Communication between commanders was slow, signals lost in the roar of wind and waves. An empire might stretch from the Nile to the Indus, but on the deck of a trireme, a soldier was as exposed as any farmer in the field. Still, as the fleet pushed westward, there could be no doubt. Persia's gaze was fixed on Greece. The commanders knew their objectives: punish Eretria, subdue Athens, and secure the Aegean once and for all. The great gamble of Marathon was beginning, not on land, but upon the sea. The Persian armada did not sail in a straight line toward Athens. It moved like a tide, touching each island in turn, sometimes with fire, sometimes with mercy. Each stop was carefully chosen, not only for supplies, but for the message it sent. The first target was Naxos, an island that had defied Persian authority before. The inhabitants resisted, hoping their walls and their courage might hold. But resistance only invited ruin. Persian troops stormed ashore, smashed through defenses, and burned the city to the ground. Survivors were rounded up, shackled, and marched to the ships. The flames of Naxos rose high into the night, visible to neighboring islands. It was a warning written in smoke: defy the great king, and your city will be ashes. From there, the fleet sailed on to Delos, a tiny island, but one with immense symbolic weight. Delos was the sacred birthplace of Apollo and Artemis, gods of light, music, and prophecy. Every Greek knew of its sanctity. The people of Delos chose wisely. They did not resist. Instead, they submitted, offering no obstacle to the Persian landing. What followed shocked the Greeks, who later heard of it. Instead of burning Delos as they had Naxos, the Persians made lavish sacrifices to Apollo. Datis himself, the stern Median commander, is said to have walked into the sanctuary, bowed before the god, and ordered gifts to be laid upon the altar. The city was left untouched, its temples remained standing, its people unharmed. The message could not have been clearer. Persia was not at war with Greek gods. It was not blind destruction. It was choice. If you surrendered, Persia would honor your traditions. If you resisted, Persia would annihilate you. Fire for Naxos, reverence for Delos, a carrot and a stick carried on the waves. For the islanders of the Aegean, watching the fleet approach was like watching fate itself draw near. They knew the stories of cities enslaved, of temples spared, of choices that meant survival or death. The empire was teaching them a lesson in submission, one island at a time. This careful blend of terror and respect was no accident. Darius and his commanders understood that conquest was not only about swords and spears, it was about psychology. By showing mercy at Delos, they demonstrated that Persia's empire could encompass even the most sacred spaces of the Greek world. By burning Naxos, they showed that defiance would bring nothing but ruin. When word of these events reached the mainland, the Athenians understood. Persia was not simply marching on them with brute force. Persia was playing a game of symbols, carefully constructing the idea of inevitability. Resistance was painted as both futile and sacrilegious, and yet, in that space between fear and faith, the seeds of defiance were growing. Athens watched the smoke from Naxos, heard the stories from Delos, and knew its own time was coming. After Delos, the Persian fleet pressed westward toward its first great prize on the mainland, Eretria, perched on the northern coast of Euboea. It was not a random choice. Eretria had stood beside Athens in the Ionian Revolt, sending ships and soldiers to burn Sardis. Darius had not forgotten. Now, the Persians came to exact a balance, a city for a city. Inside Eretria's walls, the mood was divided. Some argued to resist, to fight for their freedom. Others whispered of surrender, of cutting a deal before the city was destroyed. As the Persian fleet approached, Eretria's leaders chose the former. The gates were barred, the defenses manned, and the people braced themselves for siege. The assault came swiftly. Persian troops landed in force, surrounding the city. Siege engines rolled forward, archers filled the sky with arrows, and the thunder of rams shook the gates. For 6 days, the Eretrians held out. Fires flared along the walls. Counterattacks repelled ladders and towers. To the people, it seemed possible. Perhaps the gods would favor them. Perhaps the Persians could be held at bay. But on the 7th day, betrayal undid what courage had built. 2 prominent citizens opened the gates to the invaders. The reasons are lost to us: ambition, fear, perhaps Persian gold. But the effect was certain. The Persians poured in, their soldiers flooding the streets like a tide. Temples were stripped bare, homes set alight. Families were torn apart, men cut down, women and children dragged into captivity. Herodotus tells us the entire population was enslaved, bound in chains and carried off across the sea. Whether every last soul was taken or not, the impact was clear. Eretria ceased to exist as a free city. Its walls still stood, but its spirit was gone. The sack of Eretria was not just punishment, it was theater. Word of its destruction raced across Greece. Here was proof that Persia remembered old grudges, that no act of defiance was ever forgotten. To the Athenians watching from across the strait, the message was unmistakable. You are next. And yet, in its cruelty, the fall of Eretria hardened Athenian resolve. If surrender led only to chains and resistance, even doomed resistance was the only path to dignity, then Athens would have to choose the latter. The smoke of Eretria was a warning, but also a challenge. The Persians had destroyed one city, another still waited. News of Eretria's fall struck Athens like a thunderclap. Refugees staggered across the narrow strait, their eyes hollow, their stories filled with fire and chains. The Persians had shown no mercy. Athens knew what awaited if it too was taken. Yet within the city walls, the debate was far from settled. Athens was still young in its experiment with democracy. Barely 2 decades earlier, the reforms of Cleisthenes had broken the grip of the old aristocratic clans. Citizens now voted in the assembly, organized not by kinship, but by tribe. 10 tribes, 10 generals, each with equal say in matters of war. Power was shared more broadly than in any city-state before it. But with that freedom came division. Some Athenians, particularly among the wealthy elite, saw in Persia an opportunity rather than a threat. If Athens surrendered, they argued, the city might keep its temples, its markets, its lives. Persia often allowed its subjects to retain local customs so long as they paid tribute and swore loyalty to the great king. For those who feared losing wealth and influence in the turbulent democracy, Persia promised stability and power. Others, however, recoiled at the thought. Submission meant slavery in all but name. Tribute to Persia was not merely a tax. It was a declaration that Athens could not rule itself. To those who cherished the fragile new democracy, resistance was a matter of survival. Better to die free on the battlefield than live under the shadow of an empire. And so the assembly split, voices rising, fists pounding on benches. The threat of civil fracture loomed as large as the Persian fleet itself. If the city faltered in unity, it might fall without a fight. Beyond the walls, the army mustered. Farmers put aside their plows, craftsmen set down their tools, and citizens of every tribe donned the bronze helmet and the heavy aspis shield. These were not professional soldiers. They were men defending their homes, their families, and the fragile system of self-rule that had given them a voice. Yet even as they armed themselves, doubt gnawed at them. Would their neighbors betray them to Persia? Would their leaders argue until it was too late? In this moment of crisis, Athens found an unexpected source of strength, not in numbers nor in allies, but in the simple fact of its democracy. Decisions would not rest on the whim of a single tyrant or king. They would be debated, contested, and finally resolved by the will of the citizens. Unity would be forged in argument, not imposed by decree. Still, unity was fragile. And as the Athenians prepared to march toward Marathon, they knew that victory in the field was not only a matter of survival against Persia, it was a safeguard against treachery at home. Only a decisive triumph could silence the pro-Persian faction once and for all. The stakes had never been higher. Defeat meant chains, victory meant survival, and the preservation of democracy itself. Among the Athenians marching toward Marathon, none loomed larger in memory than Miltiades. His story was almost as complex as the city's own. Born into a noble family around 550 BCE, he was no ordinary citizen farmer, but a man who had already ruled as a tyrant in the distant Chersonese on the Gallipoli Peninsula. For years he had served Persia itself, a vassal under Darius after the great king's armies swept through Anatolia. He knew Persian methods, Persian commanders, even Persian court politics. But like so many who stood too close to the throne, he eventually fell from favor. Accused of disloyalty, Miltiades fled back to Athens, an exile who returned home just as the storm clouds gathered. In Athens, Miltiades' past cut both ways. Some distrusted him as a man who had once bent the knee to Persia. Others valued him precisely for that same reason. He knew the enemy intimately, perhaps better than any Greek alive. When the army convened its 10 generals, one from each tribe, it was Miltiades whose voice carried the most weight. Yet in the Athenian system, he was not supreme. Command rotated daily among the 10 strategoi, the generals elected by the people. And above them all stood the polemarch, a senior officer whose role combined ritual authority with strategic oversight. At Marathon, that man was Callimachus of Aphidnae. Little is known of him beyond this moment, but Herodotus would later call his vote decisive, the swing that determined whether Athens would fight or retreat. Legend paints a picture of Miltiades persuading his fellow generals one by one, arguing that delay meant disaster, that surrender would invite treachery, that the only path left was battle. According to the story, when the generals split evenly, Callimachus cast the deciding vote for war. It is a dramatic scene, filled with conviction and risk, the moment Athens chose its destiny. But here we must tread carefully. Much of what we know of Miltiades comes through the lens of later Athenian politics, especially the career of his son, Cimon, who rose to prominence decades after Marathon. Was Miltiades truly the mastermind, or did later generations reshape the tale to glorify his name? Ancient history often leaves us with such shadows. What is certain is this: the men at Marathon were not led by kings or tyrants, but by citizens entrusted with the fate of their city. They argued, they disagreed, they voted. And in the end, they committed themselves to stand against the largest empire the world had ever known. Miltiades may have been the loudest voice, Callimachus the deciding one, but together they embodied something new, a democracy at war, its survival hinging not on divine right or hereditary rule, but on the choices of men. And with that choice made, the Athenian army marched to the plain of Marathon, where bronze and blood would test their resolve. The Persian fleet did not strike directly at the Piraeus, the harbor of Athens. Instead, its prows angled toward a broad, windswept expanse some 40 kilometers to the northeast, the plain of Marathon. At first glance, it seemed an odd choice, but the Persians had chosen wisely. Marathon was a flat coastal plain, hemmed in by mountains on one side and marshes on the other. It offered space to disembark thousands of men, water for horses, and level ground perfect for cavalry maneuvers. From there, a road cut straight across Attica toward Athens. If the Persians could secure a foothold at Marathon, they could march inland, link up with Athenian sympathizers, and crush resistance before Sparta or any ally could intervene. The choice of landing site was strategic, but it was also psychological. Marathon carried weight in the Greek imagination. According to local myth, the plain had once been the site of a battle between the Athenians and invading Amazons. It was a place tied to memory, struggle, and destiny. To plant their flag, there was to send a message. Persia did not fear Athens nor its legends. When word reached the city, the Athenians wasted no time. 11,000 hoplites marched out, their bronze armor glinting beneath the sun, shields clattering as they advanced. With them came their one steadfast ally, the Plataeans, 1,000 men strong. Small though it was, Plataea's support carried immense symbolic weight. While other Greek cities wavered, Plataea had thrown in its lot with Athens. It was not merely an alliance, it was a statement that Athens did not stand utterly alone. As the hoplites descended toward Marathon, they saw the Persian host already encamped on the plain, spreading like a dark sea across the land. Rows of tents stretched to the horizon. Horses stamped and whinnied, their riders patrolling with easy confidence. Persian archers drilled with their bows, their arrows tipped with bronze and iron. Against this vast shifting mass, the Greek phalanx seemed rigid, even small, an iron wall braced against a flood. But the terrain was not entirely to Persia's advantage. To reach Athens, their army would have to break through the Greeks first, and the Athenians had positioned themselves cleverly. They took the high ground along the foothills, where cavalry could not easily maneuver. Marshes blocked the flanks, limiting the Persian ability to encircle them. The plain that looked so perfect for Persia could, with careful defense, be turned against them. And yet, the danger was undeniable. The Persians had landed without resistance. Their ships lay anchored in the bay, their troops supplied by the fleet. If the Athenians hesitated, Persia could fortify its position, use its cavalry to control the plain, and march inland at will. Worse, whispers persisted of traitors within Athens itself, men ready to raise a signal fire once the Persians advanced, inviting them to seize the city. Thus, the stage was set. Two armies now faced one another across the fields of Marathon, the largest empire of the age, determined to make Athens a lesson, and a citizen militia determined not to be erased. For 8 days they would stare across the plain, neither willing to move, each waiting for the other to make the fatal mistake. Athens knew that its 11,000 hoplites were brave, but bravery alone could not match Persian numbers. Help was needed, and there was only one place to turn: Sparta. The name itself carried weight across Greece. Sparta's warriors were legend, men drilled from childhood in discipline and endurance, the closest thing the Greek world had to a professional army. If Sparta marched, Persia might yet be checked. And so, a runner was dispatched. Tradition gives us his name, Phaedipides, though some sources blur his role with the later Marathon Run legend. He He covered the 240 kilometers to Sparta in just 2 days, crossing mountains and valleys in a feat of endurance that astonished even his contemporaries. When he arrived, breathless and battered, he pleaded for immediate aid. The Spartans listened and agreed. They would march to Athens' side. But there was a catch. At that moment, Sparta was in the middle of the Carnaia, a sacred festival dedicated to Apollo and marked by strict rituals. Spartan law forbade military campaigns during the festival until the full moon had risen. To break that law would risk angering the gods themselves. And so, with solemn faces, the Spartan leaders told the messenger that they could not march for at least 10 days. For Athens, the reply was both relief and despair. Relief, because Sparta had promised to come. Despair, because time was running out. The Persian fleet was already ashore at Marathon, their soldiers well supplied, their cavalry pawing the earth. Could Athens afford to wait 10 days? Help of a different kind did arrive, from their small ally, Plataea. Though little more than a village compared to Athens, Plataea sent 1,000 hoplites. To modernize, this may seem a token gesture, but to the Athenians, it was immense. Plataea was not bound by geography to fight. It could have stood aside. Instead, it marched shoulder to shoulder with Athens, declaring by its action that freedom was worth risking annihilation. Later generations would never forget this act of loyalty. Yet the central problem remained. The Persians were on Greek soil, and Athens could not count on Spartan spears until the gods allowed it. The clock was ticking. Every day of delay brought Persia closer to consolidating its camp, to striking at Athens, or to finding traders willing to open the gates. So the Athenians stood at Marathon, staring across the plain at an enemy twice their size, hoping each nightfall would bring them closer to Spartan aid. But they knew too that waiting carried its own dangers. The choice to attack or not would soon have to be made. For more than a week, the two armies at Marathon faced each other across the plain. 11,000 Greek hoplites, their bronze helmets gleaming under the sun, held the line along the foothills. Below them, stretching across the flat ground to the sea, the Persian host glittered with countless spears and the shifting colors of men drawn from across an empire. Neither side moved. For the Athenians, the standoff was both a blessing and a torment. Their position was strong. With the marsh on one side and the hills at their back, the Persians could not easily surround them. Every day they waited was another day closer to the promised Spartan reinforcements. But every day was also a test of will. The men camped in armor, sleeping fitfully on the hard ground, wondering when the order would come to fight, or whether the Persians would slip away to strike at Athens undefended. For the Persians, the delay was more costly. They had brought food and fodder on their ships, but supplies dwindled quickly with an army so large. Foraging was dangerous under the watchful eyes of Greek patrols. Moreover, the longer the Greeks refused to attack, the more time Persia gave its enemies to rally allies. The entire point of the expedition had been to strike quickly and decisively, to teach Athens and Eretria a lesson before the rest of Greece could react. Now, stalled at Marathon, their aura of inevitability began to fray. And so the days passed. Men grew restless. In the Greek camp, soldiers sharpened spears and muttered that their generals argued endlessly while Persia sat within sight. In the Persian camp, archers tested their bows, cavalry drilled on the plain, and commanders debated how to draw the Greeks down into the open where horsemen could ride them down. But there was a deeper pressure, political as much as military. In Athens, pro-Persian voices whispered still. If the army withdrew back to the city, those voices might seize control, fling open the gates, and deliver Athens to the invaders without a fight. Retreat was not an option. Victory in the field was the only way to silence treachery at home. The stalemate was a fragile thing. Each day of waiting shifted the balance slightly, supplies dwindling, morale eroding, fear of betrayal growing. Both armies knew the confrontation was inevitable. What neither side knew was when or who would make the first move. And so, for 8 tense days, the plain of Marathon echoed with silence, broken only by the clatter of drills and the cries of scouts. Two armies stared across the fields, each waiting for the other to blink. On the 9th day, the stillness broke. Scouts returning from the plain brought startling news. The Persian cavalry was gone. No hoofbeats drummed across the flat ground. No horsemen patrolled the edges of the camp. The great weapon of Persia, the swift riders who could outflank the phalanx, shower it with arrows, and cut down stragglers, had vanished. For the Athenians watching from the hills, it was as if a thundercloud had suddenly lifted. The balance of power, though still uneven, had shifted. But why? Ancient sources disagree, and historians ever since have debated the mystery. Some accounts suggest the cavalry had been re-embarked onto ships, preparing to sail around the coast and strike directly at undefended Athens. Others argue the horses had been sent inland to forage for fodder and water, leaving the infantry temporarily unsupported. Still others hint at a tactical maneuver gone wrong, perhaps a feint that gave the Greeks their opening. Whatever the reason, the fact mattered more than the theory. Without cavalry, the Persians lost their greatest advantage. The Greeks, heavily armored and fighting on foot, had always feared being encircled and ridden down in the open plain. Now that fear was gone. Miltiades, the general who had long urged battle, seized on the moment. Delay was dangerous. Supplies in Athens were running thin, and treachery threatened at home. But with the cavalry absent, the risks tilted in Greece's favor. "Strike now," Miltiades urged, before the horsemen returned. The decision was not made lightly. The generals knew their men would be charging across open ground into a hail of Persian arrows. They knew the Persians still outnumbered them by more than 2-1. And yet, opportunity in war comes rarely, and only the bold grasp it. So the Greeks prepared. Shields were polished, spears checked, lines drawn up in careful order. They would march down from the hills and meet the Persians on the plain, not because the odds were good, but because the odds had never been better. The absence of the cavalry remains one of the enduring mysteries of Marathon. Some call it divine providence, others a simple matter of logistics. But to the men on the field, it was neither mystery nor miracle. It was a chance, perhaps their only chance, to stand against the empire and hope to survive. At dawn, the Athenians formed for battle. Across the plain, the Persian line stretched wide and glittering, a wall of spears, shields, and archers ready to meet them. Outnumbered more than 2-1, the Greeks knew that a conventional formation would mean disaster. If the Persians could wrap around their flanks, the phalanx would be crushed in an iron vise. It was here that Miltiades revealed his plan, simple, radical, and dangerous. Instead of thickening the center of the line, as tradition dictated, he did the opposite. He thinned the middle ranks, leaving them only a few men deep. With the soldiers freed from the center, he reinforced the flanks, creating heavy, bristling walls of spears on either wing. The risk was obvious. A weak center could be broken, split apart by Persia's massed infantry. But Miltiades gambled that if the flanks could hold and then drive forward, the Persians themselves could be encircled. In other words, he turned the Persian threat against them. The soldiers knew the danger, but they trusted the logic. Hoplites fought best in close order, shield locked to shield, spear jutting out like the fang of a beast. On the wings, they would be near unstoppable. And in the center, even if they bent, they could buy time. The difference between Greek and Persian arms only sharpened the stakes. The Athenians bore heavy bronze helmets, cuirasses, greaves, and their great round shields. The aspis, large enough to cover a man from chin to knee. The Persians, by contrast, carried lighter wicker shields and linen armor. Their strength lay in mobility, in arrows loosed at a distance, in cavalry strikes that could not come today. In a clash of spear and shield, the hoplites believed they had the edge, so the lines were drawn. 10,000 Athenians, 1,000 Plataeans at their side, stretched their formation as wide as the Persians, a thin but unbroken wall of men. Behind them, the hills fell silent. Before them, the plain shimmered in the heat, the enemy waiting with bows already strung. The generals gave the order. The phalanx began to move steady and deliberate, the ground trembling beneath the march of bronze-shod feet. And with every step, Athens drew closer to its fate. The Athenians advanced in grim silence, shields locked, spears angled forward. For most of the long march across the plain, they kept their pace steady, conserving their strength. But as they drew within 200 meters, the killing range of Persian bows, the command rang out. The hoplites broke into a run. It was a stunning sight. 11,000 armored men surging forward in near unison, bronze flashing in the sun. The Persians loosed their arrows in dark clouds, the shafts hissing down like rain. Yet the Greeks ran on, shields raised, the weight of their bronze and the speed of their charge blunting much of the storm. Arrows struck shields, ricocheted off helmets, glanced from cuirasses. Men fell, but the line did not break. Then came the crash. The phalanx slammed into the Persian front like a living wall of iron. Spears pierced wicker shields, bronze smashed into linen armor. The air filled with the shouts of men, the clash of metal, the cries of the wounded. The Greeks, trained to fight shoulder to shoulder, drove forward as one, each man's shield protecting his comrade, each spear thrust back by the weight of the line. At first it seemed the Persians would hold. Their center pressed hard, exploiting the deliberately thinned Greek ranks. Slowly, the Greek middle bent backward under the weight of superior numbers, shields splintering, spears snapping. For a heartbeat, it seemed the gamble had failed, that the Persian tide would break through and split the phalanx in two. But on the wings, the story was different. There, the Greek flanks surged ahead, their deeper ranks grinding the Persian infantry backward. Hoplites pressed relentlessly, their formation like a great bronze wedge biting into the enemy's sides. Slowly, they began to wheel inward, pivoting from the wings toward the center. The trap was closing. The Persians had broken through in the middle, but in doing so, they had overextended themselves. Now, from both sides, the reinforced Greek flanks curled inward, striking the enemy in the flanks and the rear. Confusion rippled through the Persian ranks. Soldiers who had been pushing forward found themselves attacked from three directions at once. Discipline faltered. Panic spread. What had begun as a desperate gamble was turning into something far greater, an envelopment, the very maneuver the Greeks had feared might be used against them. By thinning their own center, Miltiades had given Athens the chance to reverse the trap. And now, the largest empire on earth was being encircled by a citizen army. The plain of Marathon became a cauldron of bronze, dust, and blood. And for the first time that day, it was the Persians who began to yield. The clash at Marathon turned in a heartbeat. One moment, the Persian center was driving forward, threatening to split the Athenian line. The next, the Greek wings snapped shut like the jaws of a trap. Bronze-shielded hoplites pressed inward from both sides, spears stabbing into unprotected flanks, shields slamming into confused men who suddenly found themselves surrounded. The effect was electric. The Persians, so confident at the outset, felt the ground shift beneath them. Discipline gave way to chaos. Cries in a dozen languages filled the air as soldiers broke formation, stumbling over the bodies of their comrades, looking desperately for an escape. The proud banners of the empire sagged, trampled into the dust of the plain. Then came the rout. Panic surged through the Persian ranks, rippling outward like fire across dry grass. Men dropped their shields and ran, some toward the safety of the fleet, others into the marshes that fringed the battlefield. Those who fled into the wetlands found themselves trapped in sucking mud, cut down where they floundered or drowned under the weight of their armor. Those who ran for the ships fared little better. The Athenians pursued without mercy, cutting down their enemies even as they scrambled aboard the waiting vessels. Herodotus claims that 6,400 Persians fell that day, compared with just 192 Athenians. Figures that almost certainly bear the fingerprints of propaganda, but nonetheless capture the scale of the disaster. The victors raised a burial mound for their dead, a tumulus that still stands at Marathon. The Persians, for all their numbers, left their fallen unburied, the sea their only witness. Among the dead lay Callimachus, the polemarch, whose deciding vote had committed Athens to battle. Legend has it that he was pierced by so many spears that his body remained upright, propped like a macabre statue even in death. Whether true or not, the tale reflected how Athenians remembered him, as a man who had stood firm when the fate of the city hung in the balance. The Greeks even managed to capture 7 Persian ships, boarding them in the chaos as they tried to push off from the shore. But most of the fleet escaped, carrying the battered survivors away from the bloodied beach. The battle was over, but the danger was not. For the Persian commanders had not abandoned their greater goal. Athens itself still lay ahead and undefended. So while the Persians licked their wounds and regrouped at sea, the Athenian hoplites turned from victory to another ordeal. Exhausted, drenched in sweat and blood, they would have no time to celebrate. Another march, longer and harder than the first, still lay before them. The day belonged to Athens, but the war was not yet finished. The Athenians stood victorious at Marathon, but there was no triumph in their voices, only urgency. Across the bay, the Persian fleet was already regrouping, sails unfurled, oars dipped into the sea. The battered army was not retreating in defeat. It was moving south, intent on seizing its true prize, Athens itself. The hoplites understood the danger at once. They had left their city undefended. Behind its walls remained only the elderly, the women, and the children. If the Persians reached the harbor of Phaleron before the army returned, the gates could be thrown open from within by pro-Persian factions, or the city could be stormed outright. The victory at Marathon would mean nothing if Athens fell the next day. And so, with scarcely time to bind their wounds or drink from the streams, the Athenians marched again. Through the night, they trudged, 40 kilometers across rough, uneven ground, their bodies aching from the clash of bronze, their throats parched, their feet raw. Yet none faltered. The fate of their city pulled them onward like a tether. Imagine the sight: a column of hoplites, armor clattering, spears raised like a forest of iron, moving under the pale light of the moon. No drums marked their pace, no cheers lifted their spirits. Only the grim determination of men who knew that if they failed, their families would awaken to Persian flames. By dawn, they reached Athens. As the Persian fleet rounded Cape Saunion and entered the bay, the soldiers of the city stood waiting on the walls, shields flashing in the early light. From the sea, the Persians saw not a defenseless prize, but an army still bristling, bloodied, yet unbroken, ready for another fight. The moment of decision fell to Datis and Artaphernes. They had already lost heavily on the plain. To attempt another assault, this time against walls defended by men who had just defied the empire, was to court disaster. Reluctantly, they turned their ships away. The great expedition, conceived in vengeance and power, ended not in triumph but in withdrawal. For Athens, it was salvation. In less than 2 days, its citizen army had fought the greatest empire of the age and then marched through the night to bar the gates of its own city. They had not only won a battle, they had preserved their freedom. The Athenians looked upon their battered shields, their fallen comrades, and the ships vanishing into the horizon, and they understood, against all odds, they had survived. Athens had been saved. The Persian fleet, defeated and denied, sailed away into the Aegean. But even as the danger passed, the Athenians understood that victory on its own was not enough. Battles fade, memories dim, and enemies return. What lasts is the story. And so Marathon became more than a triumph of arms. It became a legend. One tale in particular captured the imagination. After the fighting, the Athenians, fearful that traitors in the city might open the gates, sent a runner racing back from the battlefield to announce their victory. His name, tradition tells us, was Philippides, the same herald who days before had run to Sparta to beg for aid. He covered the 42 kilometers from Marathon to Athens in a single breathless push. Stumbling into the assembly, he gasped out his message: "We have won." And then, the story says, he collapsed and died on the spot. Whether fact or embellishment, the story had power. Centuries later, when the modern Olympic Games were revived in 1896, it was this tale that gave birth to the marathon race, immortalizing in sport what had begun as legend. But the Athenians of the 5th century did not rely only on words. They built monuments to their triumph. On the field itself, they raised a great earthen tumulus, a burial mound where the 192 Athenians who fell were laid to rest together. Even today, the mound still rises from the plain, silent witness to a battle fought 2.5 millennia ago. In Athens, painters and sculptors enshrined the victory. Votive offerings were dedicated in temples, and poets sang of the day when farmers and potters had stood against the greatest empire on earth. The city's leaders used Marathon as political capital, portraying Athens as the defender of Greece, the shield of freedom. Other city-states might quibble or hesitate, but Athens, they declared, had faced the storm and prevailed. This propaganda mattered. Greek politics was as much about prestige as power. To claim the mantle of savior was to claim influence over allies and rivals alike. Marathon became not just a military success, but a symbol of destiny, that Athens was chosen by the gods to lead. The truth was more complicated. The Persians had withdrawn, yes, but they had not been destroyed. Darius still reigned, and his empire still stretched across continents. Yet in the Athenian imagination, Marathon was already transformed. It was proof that free men could stand against kings, that courage and unity could overcome sheer numbers, and that their democracy, fragile though it was, had been tested in fire and survived. The Athenians began to weave a new narrative, that on the plain of Marathon, they had not only defended their homes, but saved Greece itself. The Athenians returned from Marathon to a city buzzing with pride. Songs were sung, stories repeated, names of the fallen etched into memory. For a people who had feared annihilation only days before, the sudden shift was dizzying. Athens had not just survived, it had struck down an army of the great king. The immediate consequence was political. Those who had whispered of surrender, who had urged submission to Persia, were silenced. No one could argue against the will of a citizen army that had stared down empire and prevailed. In this way, Marathon secured not only Athens' independence, but its democracy, giving it a new foundation in blood and triumph. Yet the battle also cast a long shadow. By inflating its importance, spreading word across Greece that Athens had saved freedom itself, the city laid claim to a leadership role among the polis. This narrative of heroism would fuel Athenian ambition for decades, leading eventually to an empire of its own in the Aegean. Marathon became not just history, but political weaponry. Still, one must ask, how much had really changed? The Persian Empire remained immense, its resources untouched, its armies intact. Darius was still king, and the humiliation at Marathon only deepened his determination to punish Greece. Preparations for another, larger invasion soon began. The storm was far from over. And even within Greece, unity was fragile. Sparta had arrived too late to join the battle. Other city-states had done nothing at all. Athens stood taller in prestige, yes, but also more isolated. Its boasting of Marathon inspired admiration in some quarters, resentment in others. Perhaps the most lasting change lay not in politics, but in psychology. Marathon taught the Athenians to believe in themselves. A force of citizen farmers had stood against the most powerful army in the world and lived. That belief, that courage and cunning could balance the scales against overwhelming odds, would shape the Greek response in the years to come, when Persia returned in even greater strength. For Marathon was not the end of the Greco-Persian Wars, it was only the first act. The story of Marathon has come down to us wrapped in legend and filtered through the words of men who had every reason to exaggerate. Our chief source, Herodotus, wrote decades later, long after the dust had settled. His account mixes careful reporting with rumor, patriotic coloring, and Athenian propaganda. Later writers, seeking heroes for their own times, embroidered the tale still further. Was Miltiades truly the brilliant architect of victory, or did later generations inflate his genius to glorify his family? Did Philippides truly die after announcing the triumph, or was that tale born centuries later to feed the hunger for heroic sacrifice? Even the numbers, 6,400 Persians slain, only 192 Athenians lost, reek of patriotic symmetry. Yet if the details blur, the meaning remains. Marathon was small by the standards of great wars. Tens of thousands at most, not the hundreds of thousands claimed in legend. It was not a decisive blow against Persia, which would return in far greater force a decade later under Xerxes. But its symbolic weight was immense. Marathon became proof that an empire could bleed, that free citizens could defend their own soil against overwhelming odds. Historians today sift the evidence with care, Archaeology confirms the tumulus where the Athenian dead were buried, the marsh where Persians may have drowned, the terrain that shaped the clash. Reconstructions of Persian arms and Greek tactics show us not gods or monsters, but men, fallible, courageous, terrified. Marathon was no mythic duel of East and West, of freedom against tyranny. It was a battle of logistics, of terrain, of morale, and of timing. And yet, sometimes myth matters as much as fact. The Athenians made Marathon into a story that defined them, a story they told to justify their leadership in Greece, their naval expansion, even their empire. Later ages looked back and saw something more universal. The moment when a small, outnumbered people stood their ground against a power that seemed unstoppable. That is why Marathon still lingers in our imagination. Not because it ended the Persian threat. It did not. Not because it was a vast clash of millions. It was not. But because in its dust and blood was born an idea that determination, unity, and courage could shape history, even against impossible odds. The Persians would return. Greater battles lay ahead: Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea, names that would echo for centuries. But Marathon was the first, the place where Athens stood and did not fall. And for that, it became immortal.